Okay, this video is going to go through Chapter 3, Break 3, and in both cases I'm going to focus specifically on how you can use this chapter to help understand the two final papers that you're creating for this particular class. So I'll do a combination of here's what to look for in these particular sections for the paper purposes, as well as covering here's what she's accomplishing in these two chapters. So we'll start with Chapter 3, and then we will move on to Break 3. So Chapter 3 focuses very heavily on the idea of why are fans in these spaces, what are they getting from these spaces, and then what is it that they're doing in these spaces. So on page 135, what she goes into is a definition of what she means when she says counter institutions and how these particular fan spaces function as counter institutions. So what she develops is a working definition, so not a dictionary definition. Nowhere in there is a dictionary definition. Similarly, in your final definition paper, I do not want to see a dictionary definition. She develops this idea that Web 2.0 started to develop, and it gave people who weren't as comfortable on the internet, who weren't comfortable coding, access to the creation software that would help them create stuff, whatever the stuff is. And so then what happened with Web 2.0 is fan spaces just exploded because now more people felt comfortable with the tools that they were afforded to create the stuff that they wanted to in relation to their fandom. So what we ended up with were, and according to her, she's reading a very narrow definition of this, but men came in, started companies, said, I can be a millionaire if I create this space, and all of these little fangirls are going to make the content for me, so I don't have to do anything. I create the infrastructure, and boom, I'm a millionaire. And then, when they didn't actually become millionaires, the fans started to be concerned that the space could completely fold. All of their work could be cut. Or the example that she keeps coming back to with fanfiction.net is the powers that be within those institutions can make a unilateral decision that a very specific kind of content that fans have gotten used to, that fans have been creating for a period of time, is no longer acceptable, so they're just going to wipe it out because it was made unilaterally at a higher level than what fans have access to. So on page 135, she really works on developing that definition of what is a counter institution and how does this function as a counter institution in comparison to the Web 2.0 technologies that were coming up. You guys in your definition papers get to choose what your definition is and how it operates with all of the other words, all of the other concepts, all of the other fandoms that exist on the internet. So you get a choice of word, but this example is a really good example of how to develop an operational definition. Here's how we operate within these particular ideas, not a dictionary definition for that particular paper. As a side note, for theory purposes, what she's getting at is that fans want some control. They want some ownership over these artifacts that they're creating, over these uses, this repertoire that they're creating within these spaces. We're going to play around with that idea in the Quest Day in class. Okay, so if we keep moving on, page 135, 137, 142, 146, I've given you different page examples that talk significantly about how to use, they demonstrate how to use archived data to support a conclusion that you're coming to. They show you how to use secondary theory and your archived data to develop a conclusion. So across these pages, and for pretty much the remainder of Chapter 3, what DeCosnick is getting at is how do we understand what fans are doing in these spaces? And what she's doing is she's pulling in feminist theory as well as queer theory to say, here's how these particular practices and then this focus on content. So she's doing a content analysis of the posts that she's looking at, as well as a content analysis of the interviews that she's conducted with people who operate in these spaces to come up with the conclusion that these particular engagements, these particular uses, this particular focus on content that is not always heteronormative makes all of these fan spaces, especially the fan spaces that are predominantly participated in by women, queer spaces. They are not recreating, they are not reifying the standard heteronormative practices. Instead, they're rewriting some of these characters in ways that are more accommodating to them. So even in the cases where they're, traditional relationships between a man and a woman, they're still changing the characters in very specific ways. They're getting into the head of the men. They're including much more emotion in their discussion and in their character development, and that's what opens the space up to be read as queer spaces. Obviously, the question could be asked, do all of the participants who are participating in these spaces feel that they're queer spaces? Probably not, but that doesn't mean that we can't use theory to read them in that way. So these pages and the whole remainder of the chapter is an example of how to create an analysis paper. What you want to keep in mind is she has multiple subheadings. For your final analysis paper, one subheading discussion that looks somewhat similar to DeCosnik's is all that you're required to produce. You don't need multiple theories. You don't need to build a huge definition. You just need to have some supporting detail, a lot of data from your archive, and then you'll develop an overall discussion. What is going on? So what I have here for you are some questions, and these questions directly relate to DeCosnik's affirmational Fannish spaces and transformational Fannish spaces. So how do your archive participants use reading and writing? What is it that they're expected to do? How are they expected to do this? So one of the things that DeCosnik doesn't get into, but it's something that I am really interested in, is in most fan fiction pieces, authors write author notes. And they write them before every single post, whatever they're posting. So if they post a single chapter, it's before every chapter. If they're posting multiple chapters at a time, it's for that particular chunk of posts. There's one author's note. Sometimes there's also author's footnotes. Sometimes those engage with the readers directly. Sometimes they thank the readers. Sometimes they make excuses. The authors do a significant amount of work in their author's notes. So reading and writing is not just reading the original content and then reading the fan content, writing the fan content. It's also these individual practices that start to pop up depending on what's valued by the space. Reblogging, liking, those all fall under reading and writing practices because they are a form of reading and writing. Am I more likely to write when a lot of other people have? Yes. If I see a post that has a significant number of likes and I don't understand it, I'm going to investigate further if I feel like that particular community is representative of me. So I will connect with what that high number of likes means. I'm reading it, and then I will do something, writing, repertoire, so that I can then engage with that particular idea. That's the data that she's using when she talks about these spaces as queer spaces. What are these particular participants doing? How are they doing it? And what's going on there? In the second section, she goes into more about infrastructure. So if infrastructure provides specific tools, is it the infrastructure that drives fan behavior, or is it fan behavior and fan desires in this idea of cultural representations that are lacking, especially from female perspectives, that's driving their behavior? So one of the things she said repeatedly over the past few chapters is what fans have a tendency to do is to go in and read all of the archives. What you guys, the point you guys are at in your final project right now is reading the archives. You are lurking in these spaces to understand what is the cultural behavior. That's actually normal Fannish behavior for most people. We want to understand what's going on, why it's going on that way. So the big question she's asking is it the infrastructure that's driving that because all of this is available? Or is it the lack of cultural representation, and so just our need to engage with culture that's driving that particular behavior? She comes to the conclusion that it's definitely the cultural need, the cultural representation that but encourages new participants within these communities to go through all of the archives first. So again, that's reading and writing practices that are then tied back to the data that you've collected from your space that then lead to a specific analysis. So then this all comes together for your analysis paper. Okay, so the other example I want to use for this is, so JAF is Jane Austen Fan Fiction. That's the fan fiction site that I have a tendency to follow. So what I've seen in this fan fiction site is there are a handful of men who write fan fiction, and there are those same handful of men who read the fan fiction that's published. But it's really obvious to me which posts are posted by men and which posts are posted by females. They have very different behaviors when they're actually approaching posting and then how they put their stories out there. What I've noticed that I thought was kind of interesting, especially if we come back to the idea of affirmational Fannish space and transformational Fannish space, is these spaces definitely exist for these particular males as affirmational Fannish spaces. The men were able to find the connection that they wanted in the community, and after publishing, and there's one particular person that I'm thinking of, he posted 2 really well-received stories in this particular space, and then they were so well-received that he pulled them down and he published them. So there is some fan fiction that's published, despite what DeCosnik says in this particular chapter. And now, instead of posting things as fan fiction, he advertises the published fan fiction all of the new fan fiction that he's creating as published, so you have to go and pay for it. He contributes to the space through a blog as an expert on very specific Louisiana culture and very specific historical culture and very specific historical knowledge, but it's all a very, it's kind of it's canon based. I mean, he is putting his knowledge out there in a very specific way to say, I understand canon, now go buy my book. Where most of the other women are putting their work out there and they're saying, don't copy this, don't talk about this on Goodreads, because once I'm done publishing here, once I've gotten all of your guys' feedback, I'm going to revise and then I'm going to attempt to publish. It's very different approaches. Very, very different approaches to how we're actually understanding how these spaces operate. So keep that in mind. There could be differences across gender in your spaces for how we understand, how we use, how we view, and what we do with reading and writing practices. Okay, last one is break 3, and I'm going to relate this specifically again to your analysis paper. So what break 3 is focusing on is the idea of media time versus fan time. And what DeCostick is pointing out is there is a huge argument right now about media time versus fan time. And the theory that she's drawing from is saying that media time is drawing or indicating or forcing fan time to exist on a very specific strict schedule, and that's not okay. That's not allowing fans to actually enjoy and engage with their fandom. It's hyper creating a specific kind of fandom. So my example for this, we like to watch The Voice when they do their blind auditions, and what The Voice does, so it's that singing show that's on TV, what The Voice does is they pre-record their blind auditions and then they air them across several days, and they're airing them weeks after the blind auditions have happened. And what you'll notice is across the bottom you see the Twitter feed for the judges, and sometimes you see Twitter feed for fans popping up saying that we're live tweeting during the blind auditions. None of that is live. The tweeting is live, but the actual blind audition is not live, and so we're forcing this fake fan time into the airing of The Voice to drum up viewership, to drum up sponsorship, to show, look, this is how strong and solid our show is and that it has been. So this is the negative aspect of media time that the author is arguing against in this particular chapter. So what DeCostick is focusing on instead is fan time. When do fans find time for their behavior? How do they understand how to find time to be fans? And then what do they do with that particular time? And what she's saying is, why can't it coexist when television shows are airing? Why do we have to have such a huge issue with that? Why can't we just leave it alone? So that's her big question. So what you guys need to think about, depending on the space that you're following, when you actually go to collect your data, and I know some of us have talked about when you're going to collect your data, the rest of us will get to it, what you want to think about is, does the airing of episodes, so this fake or forced media time influence, could it possibly influence how you collect your data? Don't let that change your plan. Just account for it when you discuss your data, because it could influence how the people in your space are operating, why they're operating that particular way, the amount of data that they're possibly creating during that time period or something like that. It's something to be aware of, not something that should drive your overall methodology. So that's what you want to think about in relation to your analysis paper, and that's what DeCostick means by media time versus fan time. As always, if you guys have any questions, let me know. Feel free to send me a tweet if you are still a little bit confused on any of these theories. This is a really, really dense chapter, but what we want to understand it as is reading and writing practices, which are uses, which is repertoire. How is reading understood? How is writing understood? What are the reading and writing practices, and how can we understand those for our particular space so that we can figure out how to find data? If you have any questions, send me a tweet or send me an email. I'll see you guys in class.